Sending help instead of the police in Albuquerque. Published by The New Yorker. A novel community safety department has been taking calls off the hands of a force with the country's second highest fatal shooting rate. Has it improved public safety? In the southeastern corner of Albuquerque, near a wide mountain pass that opens onto an expanse of arid high plains, Sean Martin and Isaiah Curtis drove toward a Blake's Lottaburger, a regional fast food chain. Behavioral health workers with Albuquerque Community Safety, a new city department, they respond to calls, mostly from 911, about nonviolent crises involving mental health, homelessness, or substance use. ACS responders are trained to connect people from some of the city's most vulnerable populations with professional help. In doing so, they also reduce those residents' interactions with local law enforcement agencies, which in recent years have had the second highest fatal shooting rate among major American cities. Martin and Curtis were following a tip from a local nonprofit about a man who'd expressed an interest in housing vouchers. Behind the restaurant, they drove past dirt lots strewn with bottles and clothing. Near a short concrete wall, there were 2 charred tree stumps. It seemed that someone had set them on fire to stay warm, but the area was deserted. It was late morning at the end of November, and the air temperature hovered around 40 degrees. Overnight, it had dropped well below freezing. Martin, who is 52 and wore dark jeans, brown roper boots, and a green parka, stopped the car in front of the restaurant. He and Curtis, who is 35 and wore a gray, department-branded jacket with "Behavioral Health Responder" embroidered on the chest, entered to ask workers if they'd seen anyone matching the man's description. No luck. They returned to their car, which was loaded with medical equipment, as well as water, granola bars, and donated clothing to pass out during their rounds. As they readied to leave, they saw a different man on the other side of the street, sitting on a short retaining wall with several bags. "Should we?" Curtis asked. They crossed the road and introduced themselves, explaining that they could help connect him with resources he might need. The man, who hadn't heard of Albuquerque Community Safety, said that he'd just got a job but, living on the street, didn't know how he'd keep it. He said he felt hopeless. Martin and Curtis knew that local shelters were mostly full, but Curtis hoped that the man having a job might give him a chance. He called a contact at the Albuquerque Opportunity Center, one of the city's few long-term shelters, who agreed to reserve their final bed for the man. Martin and Curtis offered a ride, but the man, who appeared shocked, said he could get himself where he needed to be. He started to cry. As they walked away, Martin said, "That was a really good one. It's not great that anyone's feeling hopeless, but it's great when someone's looking for something, for housing, and we know how to help him." Curtis crossed the 4-lane road and got back to the car. As Martin and I waited for the traffic to clear, an approaching Albuquerque Police Department cruiser switched on its megaphone. "Use the crosswalk," an officer said, from within. He repeated his order, and Martin laughed. We walked to the nearest intersection. Albuquerque Community Safety has 54 full-time crisis responders, who now field most of the calls related to mental health and homelessness that previously would have gone to police officers or other first responders. The department was created in 2020, during the national reckoning over police violence sparked by the killing of George Floyd, and began operating a year later. Between 1.25% of people killed by police in the U.S. are in the midst of a mental health crisis. Removing cops from such situations has special significance in Albuquerque, where a pattern of excessive force by police officers, particularly in dealing with people with mental illness, has persisted for decades. The Albuquerque Police Department has been in a consent decree with the Department of Justice since 2014, longer than nearly any other law enforcement agency. ACS responders come from myriad backgrounds. Martin was previously a social worker and case manager in Austin. Curtis is Diné, Navajo, from Shiprock, and worked with homeless clients at an Albuquerque health clinic for Native Americans. There are former teachers, nurses, and firemen. There's an ex-MMA fighter and ex-officers from the Albuquerque Police Department. ACS's modest white Ford hybrids, bearing the department's name in a cheerful typeface, are now a common sight around the city. And its responders, who are unarmed and don't wear formal uniforms, have come to signify something new in Albuquerque. An effort that focuses less on penalizing low-level crime and instead, with a softer touch, attempts to address some of its causes. The department ranks its incoming calls. Suicidal ideations are high. and unsheltered individual call, lower. But most of the calls that are sent to ACS would be considered less urgent for police. Cops might take several hours to respond, or not at all. ACS responders might be there in minutes. They now take nearly 1,500 911 calls a month, about 3% of the million-plus that Albuquerque receives a year. To date, ACS has responded to more than 20,000 calls. Less than 1% have required eventual police involvement. Similar efforts exist in many cities, including Cahoots, in Eugene, Oregon, a 3-decade-old program that pioneered alternative first response, and STAR, in Denver, one of many pilot programs which have cropped up since 2020. ACS is the first to be an independent city-funded department reporting directly to the mayor, resulting in funding, staffing, and a caseload capacity far greater than those of other programs. Alex Vitale, the coordinator of Brooklyn College's Policing and Social Justice Project, told me that ACS, which also runs violence prevention, street outreach, and community assistance programs, shows how alternative approaches can address just the huge range of things that we were told that only armed police could deal with. He added, that is just not true. The department's responders frequently encounter the same people. Earlier in November, I rode with Roxana Balbuena, a 29-year-old South Texan who previously worked at a rape crisis center in Albuquerque, and Colin Kelly, a 30-year-old Burqueño and former Albuquerque police officer. Sean Martin joined, too. He was reviewing the call log, which ACS shares with police, firefighters, and paramedics, and noticed a familiar-sounding report. Is this the Romanians? Balbuena asked. She explained that a group of people, whom the responders believe are Romanian, had been seen panhandling with kids at a handful of intersections. ACS had interacted with them multiple times, including just the day before. Whenever ACS teams approached, Martin said, the group tended to flee. We make the appropriate reports and referrals, he added. Then the rest is kind of out of our hands. Martin fielded another familiar call, a welfare check on a woman who had repeatedly called 911 to complain that a man was wandering around her neighborhood and hurting women. It was Martin's 4th call at the home, and ACS's 7th. Martin said the woman's claim had so far been unsubstantiated. We pulled up near her home, a few blocks south of Route 66, on a street that often attracts tourists. The house at its end was a filming location for Breaking Bad, the apartment Jesse shared with Jane, and where Jane died. The door was behind the house, down a short alleyway, and Martin knocked on it, announcing he was with ACS. A few windows were ajar. The team sensed movement from within, but no one answered. After a few minutes, they left. The department sometimes gets multiple calls on the same individual daily or weekly, Erica Gutierrez, an ACS supervisor, told me. We continue to try to help them because one day they're going to be ready to change. Until that time comes, she added, we want to build that rapport with them. ACS doesn't compel anyone to go into treatment, with rare exceptions, such as when there's a threat of imminent harm. Several times, I watched responders approach people who, despite being in apparent need, decline services. Martin explained that the policy is not only legally and ethically necessary but has a therapeutic benefit, too. In some cases, it's the only power they have in their lives, to make those decisions, he said. Every day, they find people who are ready. That morning's first call was for a woman in a wheelchair who had called dispatchers to request ACS. Her last known location was a Greyhound and Amtrak depot, where a Spanish Mission clock tower watches over a series of outdoor seating areas that usually host dozens of homeless people. Kelly circled the area a few times, but the woman was gone. Then a man approached, wearing brown pants and a brown jacket. He said he recognized the car, and asked the responders for a ride to detox. He was from Oklahoma, he said, and had been in Albuquerque 3 months and was ready for a change. Kelly and Balbuena placed his belongings in white garbage bags, a precaution to keep a person's possessions together, and stashed them in the trunk. The car's back window was ringed with stringed lights interspersed with purple spiders, a decoration from Halloween. I need to stop at Lowe's soon for some Christmas lights, Balbuena said. The spirit and timing of ACS's creation, nearly 3 years ago, conjured a vision of greater public safety in Albuquerque, including increased protection of its residents from police. When Albuquerque Mayor Tim Keller announced its formation, the then chief of police, claiming that his officers were stretched too thin, welcomed an alternative department that would take low-priority calls off offices' hands and free them up to focus on violent crime, which was rising unpredictably. ACS being a distinct entity has tangible benefits, Mariela Ruiz Angel, the organization's director, told me, including that police have no formal influence over the organization's vision or operation. But that arrangement cuts both ways. The creation of ACS has not done much to change the culture of the Albuquerque police, Baron Jones, a senior policy analyst with the ACLU of New Mexico, told me. Nor has the new department materially affected police operations or accountability measures. Albuquerque Police Department officers shot at a record 18 people in 2022, killing 10. Most of those killed appeared to be suffering from a mental health crisis, according to reporting from the Albuquerque Journal. By contrast, police in New York City, which has a population 15 times greater than Albuquerque's, fatally shot 13 people in 2022. Across the country, it was on average a record year for fatal police violence. The current Albuquerque police chief, Harold Medina, has attributed last year's shootings in part to a pandemic-era rise in both national firearm sales and homicide rates. The homicide rate in Albuquerque has risen some 27% since 2018. Gilbert Gallegos, a spokesperson for the Albuquerque Police Department, said that some of the shooting victims may have been suffering from a crisis, but it is unknown for most of them. What we do know is the vast majority over the past 5 years have been under the influence of drugs, usually meth, and/or alcohol. In late January, the Albuquerque police announced a revision of its use of force policies, which law enforcement officials hope will limit the use of fatal force. Jones, of the ACLU, said that for ACS to start making a significant impact, its funding needs to be orders of magnitude above where it's at right now. ACS's 2023 budget is $11.7 million. The Albuquerque police budget is more than 20 times larger, $262 million for 2023. It has increased 25% since 2020, when the creation of ACS was announced. By the end of the winter, ACS will grow its roster of responders beyond 70, allowing it to take on greater numbers of calls. But that workforce still won't be enough to have staffing around the clock. Currently, responders work between 6 a.m. and 8 p.m. in August. During that overnight gap, police responded to a call about an intoxicated man parked for hours at a gas station downtown. The kind of down and out call that might otherwise have gone to ACS. Gallegos, the police spokesman, disputed whether ACS would have responded to the call. During the police encounter, the man, Keyshawn Thomas, admitted to recent mental health troubles, handed over a loaded gun magazine, and said that he had a weapon in the trunk of his green Dodge Challenger. About 10 minutes later, with Thomas sitting in the driver's seat, the responding officers, after allegedly seeing a gun in his hand, fired at him 16 times. Thomas, who was 27, died immediately. After the shooting, the officers found a handgun in the cab of the car, a single bullet in its chamber. Police released only some of the body cam footage of the scene. It does not clearly show the position of the gun or Thomas's hands before, during, or immediately after the shooting. The incident is being investigated by the city. A fundamental problem for ACS is that its success depends on outside resources from nonprofit and city partners, homeless shelters, detox centers, behavioral health care providers, which routinely fail to meet the city's needs. So many times people reach out for help, and there's nothing available. And that just kind of crushes that hope inside, Martin told me. Curtis added that sometimes the wait for services is measured by months rather than days or hours. In Albuquerque, a city of just over 500,000, the number of people experiencing homelessness has doubled in the past year, to about 3,000, a rate that's nearly 3 times the national average. According to Hank Hughes, the senior advisor and former executive director of the New Mexico Coalition to End Homelessness, there aren't enough services to meet demand. A new emergency shelter will eventually offer more than 250 beds, satisfying some need, but that capacity is still years away. Hughes said the city also needs more affordable housing, a supply that shrunk during the pandemic, as the cost of housing soared. Ava Montoya, a spokesperson for Mayor Keller, said the city is doing everything in our power to address gaps in our community. Albuquerque is also still feeling the effects of a dismantling, in 2013, of the state's mental health care system, when the former governor, Susana Martinez, accused 15 of the state's private providers of fraud and suspended their operations. In a subsequent investigation, the state's attorney general found no evidence of fraud. This created an enormous dearth of services statewide, and a backlog for treatment. Nothing ever replaced it, David Burke, the president of the National Alliance on Mental Illnesses Albuquerque chapter, said. The gap is so wide I don't even know how they're going to fix it. Operating at the intersection of these emergencies, ACS faces a mandate that outstrips its resources. Considering this, David Correa, a University of New Mexico professor and a co-founder of the research and advocacy group Abolish APD, dismissed the department as a token effort. This is just about managing a crisis in a way that doesn't look quite so militaristic. Ruiz Angel, ACS's director, acknowledged that it did not have the resources or expertise to address the city's myriad social problems. That's like asking paramedics to fix diabetes, or police officers to fix domestic violence, she told me. But greater recognition of the department has come with greater expectations. ACS's messaging in its first year was good enough that people now generally know what it is. Its new challenge is to get people to understand its limits. In late November, Martin and Curtis responded to a welfare check in northeast Albuquerque. A woman had called 911, worried about her adult son. She said he'd been up for 24 hours, swinging in and out of agitation. He'd spent the night pacing the house, at times carrying on an imaginary conversation with his brother, who lived out of state. When the responders arrived, the son was lying on a couch near the front door, under a duvet. Curtis sat down nearby and asked him several questions, including if he'd be interested in mental health treatment. The son responded with subtle head movements, or not at all. Later, outside with the mother, Martin and Curtis explained that they weren't able to do much more, and that to involuntarily hospitalize her son would require the intervention of an ACS clinician along with a uniformed police officer. Usually, such teams are only dispatched to scenes of active violence. The mother was visibly disappointed. Afterward, Martin told me he understood her frustration. They think, what do I need to do? Wait until they're destroying my property? Curtis added, there is help, we just can't force that individual to get help. Later, after night had fallen, Curtis noticed a 911 call from the same address. The mother told dispatchers that her son's behavior had escalated, and that he'd shoved his father several times. Curtis claimed the call, and phoned the mother to let her know that he and Martin were on their way. She was not happy to hear from me, he said, after hanging up. While Curtis and Martin were en route, a message came in over the radio telling them to stand down. Albuquerque police were taking over the call, sending an officer and a department behavioral health specialist. Curtis suggested that perhaps things had turned more violent. Or, he said, the woman had called 911 again and specifically requested the cops. Curtis and Martin hadn't been able to do anything for her son in the moment, but Martin said that's part of ACS's strategy. I think the importance of our team is that kind of time-sensitive intervention, he said. Because on a morning, any given morning, someone may be ready for help and can't get it. And then by the afternoon they wouldn't take it. Later that evening, the mother texted Curtis, providing updates and asking when ACS would arrive. Curtis called her and explained that the cops were responding and should be on their way. He couldn't say when. 2 hours after the mom's second call to 911, the police team was still not on the scene. The call log read that no units were available.